Have you ever looked back on something years after the fact and thought, wait, was that... You know that feeling that you get when you're explaining an experience to someone and you actually hear yourself talking and some realizations start hitting you like a ton of bricks? Like maybe your date asks you about your religious beliefs and you explain you're not really spiritual anymore, even though you grew up driving 30 minutes every Sunday to attend a 50-person church in the more rural part of the city you lived in, and you had to follow a very specific set of cherry-picked rules and weren't allowed to close your bedroom door at any point in your life, and you weren't allowed to move out of your home until you were married, and you realized nothing you owned was actually yours and in your name at the age of 26, and the people who did have their name on all of it were talking about buying a really big piece of property and moving all of your family and friends onto it. And as you're saying all of this out loud, you realize for the first time exactly what it sounds like. When most people hear the word cult, they think about groups like the People's Temple or Heaven's Gate. Some people might think of The Remnant or Love Has Won or maybe even the Duggars. Sometimes it's really easy to tell when something is a cult. Other times, not so much. Like, is it just an unorthodox religion? Is it a fandom? Is it a group run by a charismatic leader who controls the members for their own benefit, often to those same members' detriment? For years, I've been trying to figure out if what I experienced during my childhood and until about 26 years old would be considered a cult, or just a series of very unfortunate events with some bad people who were in positions of authority. But however you want to define it, I eventually got out, and a lot of what helped me get out was simply the fact that I went to public school. You would think that someone who owned every Dr. Dobson book, read the Left Behind series like it was the Bible Part 2, and believed Focus on the Family was going to save America would have insisted on the children being homeschooled, but lucky for me, I was annoying. And the last thing my family wanted to do was spend even more time with me than they had to, so for a few hours a day from Monday through Friday, I was exposed to something outside of the small echo chamber that I was usually confined in. It was at school that I listened to American Idiot for the first time in 6th grade on a burned CD that a girl in my English class made for me. I went to Hot Topic with middle school friends instead of C28 with the girls I knew from church. I borrowed the forbidden, devil-worshipping Harry Potter books from another girl, covered them with a Bible jacket, and read them right at the dinner table in front of my family. I saw the Boondocks for the first time on my improv captain's laptop in our high school drama department's green room, and then I cried over the movie Frida at a slumber party before we sang along to Tegan and Sarah albums for the rest of the night. But all of that involved sneaking around, and a lot more often than not, I would go to school, come home, and then be under pretty much constant supervision. The only time this wasn't the case was during the summer when everybody was at work and I was home alone. Now back then, the TV in my house had parental control locks, and it took me a little while to figure it out, but eventually I was able to determine the passcode on the remote based on which buttons had the most wear on them. And every summer while I was locked in the house all day, I would watch movies and TV shows that I would find on cable. This was how I saw the movie A Dirty Shame for the first time. I'm going to be using a lot of euphemisms when talking about this movie so I don't get flagged, so bear with me, and remember to like, subscribe, drop a comment, and share with your friends so I can keep making videos like this. A lot of people hate this movie. It has a 54% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's often regarded as John Waters' worst movie, and some people speculate that it failing so hard at the box office is what caused the director to take a 20-year break from filmmaking. But when 16-year-old me stumbled across it one afternoon, it was life-changing. A Dirty Shame is about a town called Harford Road that is made up of two kinds of people: the neuters, who are pearl-clutching Puritans that believe carnal desires are filthy, and the perverts, a bunch of concussed individuals whose fetishes are on full, unbothered display after suffering head injuries. The protagonist, Sylvia, is a neuter, and her daughter, Caprice, who goes by the name Ursula Utters when she go-go dances at the local biker bar, is a pervert with N-cup-sized implants who has a thing for indecent exposure. After Sylvia locks Caprice in the family garage to try to curb her sinful ways, she's whacked over the head with a garden tool, and then it's Johnny Knoxville, the mystical, magical leader of the perverts, sees this happen, and he determines that Sylvia is actually his 12th apostle who's going to help them discover a brand new act. Also, Patty Hearst is in this movie. The granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, who was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army, is in this movie. This doesn't have anything to do with anything, but it always makes me go, huh, every time I watch the movie. That's all. A Dirty Shame was rated NC-17, and I think if John Waters was ever going to successfully appeal that rating with the MPAA, it would have had a 5-minute runtime. A Dirty Shame is campy, ridiculous, and has so much full frontal nudity. Like many things we like when we're teenagers, we often see how utterly cringy they are once we reach adulthood, and I assumed my love of this movie was going to be my own personal Dirty Shame when I watched it before making this video last week. Nope, I still love it. Don't get me wrong, it definitely has its problems. There's some very outdated language here and there, the cast is almost entirely people of this kind of pasty variety, but the movie also really had its special moments for someone who is being indoctrinated every day about what Jesus thought when it came to their bodily urges. For example, Johnny Knoxville's character Ray Ray, he tells Sylvia when he's introducing her to the perverts that everything is okay as long as it's safe, consensual, and doesn't hurt anyone. There's also many different kinds of body types depicted, which is really cool. We just don't see the classic Hollywood physique on screen here. We see many different ages and shapes of people. Back when it was released in 2006, America was just a few years away from marriage equality, and there was only more representation of LGBTQIA+ people in the media with each passing season. Society seemed to be skewing more sex positive, and we were quickly approaching fourth wave feminism. The neuters were losing, just like in the movie. Today, women's and the queer community's rights are being rolled back to a frightening degree. Gen Z just doesn't seem to be participating in the horizontal tango very much, and it seems like around 2016, everyone just got super puritanical again about relations in general. These days, it feels more like the neuters aren't losing. By the time I saw A Dirty Shame, I had already begun to question the very deep conservative values that had been lectured to me. This was in no small part because my repressed teenage hormones made it impossible to think about anything else besides what the adults in my life referred to as fornicating.
Don't have sex. Sex is for married people.
So a movie about a character constantly and frantically trying to get laid really spoke to me on a deep spiritual level.
You should move downtown where you belong, you whore!
So I looked up John Waters, and I read about the man who made this movie, how he was called the Pope of Trash, and how he made films that were an exercise in poor taste. Interviews showed him to be incredibly charming and charismatic, which was how the devil had always been described to me. John Waters seemed like he just wanted to make people laugh and have fun. He also seemed to be a lot kinder than the people that I was spending time with. I've always had trouble sleeping. When I was a little kid, I was scared of ghosts and spirits and demons because I was told those were things that were very much real and out to get us, so I was terrified of the dark and silence. So sometimes I would sneak out into the living room after everyone else in the house was asleep, turn on all the lights, and watch PBS at like 12 a.m. More often than not, it was Celtic Woman or Yanni that was on the screen, but other times, it was Carl Sagan's Cosmos series. I had been told my entire life that the Earth had been created in 7 days, and anyone who said otherwise was an agent of, you guessed it,
Satan.
All of this proof for intelligent design had been repeatedly put in front of me for years, and I always parroted it like a good little kid who wanted their family to like them. But I always felt stupid too, because what I was told to say never made any sense, while the people who poked holes in creationist logic always did so in a way that actually made perfect sense. Carl Sagan broke everything down in his segment on the origin of life so well and made it so accessible, it actually scared me. What if there really was no God or creator? Was there no heaven waiting for me after I shuffled off this mortal coil? If I stopped believing in everything I had ever been taught and started living my life the way that I actually wanted to, would I be in eternal pain like everyone in my life told me I would be every single day? Or would there just be black nothingness after I passed away? And which was more horrifying, eternal damnation or nothing? Carl Sagan's work would be what I would lean on for the next 10 years as I began to slowly deconstruct from how I was raised. I remember being in my late teens and reading The Demon-Haunted World as I was trying to balance faith and science when I came across the line, "Science is not only compatible with spirituality, is a profound source of spirituality." At the time, that was comforting in a way that I really needed because I thought that maybe I could believe in some kind of higher power and still acknowledge science. And as I've gotten older and significantly more skeptical, cynical, and nihilistic, it's still comforting, but in a different way. To quote Sagan again, "The nitrogen in our DNA, the calcium in our teeth, the iron in our blood, the carbon in our apple pies were made in the interiors of collapsing stars. We are made of star stuff." That still gets me emotional. How utterly beautiful is that? I love thinking about how we're all connected from our inception and because of the continued recycling of atoms. In some way, we have always been and always will be here in some form, kind of depending on how you look at it, of course, which I think is kind of how spirituality should be, just us personally coping with our imminent loss of consciousness. And the Cosmos series wasn't the only nonfiction style show that was one of the few examples I got when it came to critical thinking. Everyone in my AP History and Political Science classes watched something called The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, a show that was repeatedly called radical far leftist propaganda in my own home, but I had never actually sat down and watched it. Well, I had tried, but anytime it was on, someone was loudly talking over Jon about how wrong he was. And that was actually something that was really typical in the 2000s. People could just pop off about anything and say that it was correct. Having technology at our fingertips in the form of a laptop where we could fact check anything was still new, but something I was very much getting familiar with as a teenager, and I loved it. I was also learning in school what a reputable source was and why something was a reputable source, and as it turned out, a family member simply shouting and berating something that didn't fit their agenda didn't count as a reputable source. Today, we all have phones with information even more readily accessible, so now we don't have problems like people spreading misinformation, and nobody can just say, "No, I don't like that, so it's not true," super loudly until enough of their fellow bozos take them seriously. Can you imagine living in a world like that? Some might say it would be a clear sign of a society in rapid decline. Reruns of Daria used to play on this channel called The N, which was a Canadian teen network that we got for some reason, and despite the premise being a slice-of-life sitcom, it was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Daria's suburbia was presented as being satirical, but it seemed like the first honest depiction of middle-class American life that I had ever seen. The show was able to put into words all of the criticisms of pop culture and society that I had never been able to. Only a few years before I started watching the show, my family had moved into what I think would have been called solidly middle class. By the time I was a teenager, there weren't bars on our bedroom windows anymore, our neighbors weren't being hospitalized by our other neighbors, and we were allowed to walk our dog around the block and even go to the park. But there were also a lot of rules, and everyone who went to my school seemed to instinctively know these rules that I just didn't. And when I say rules, I mean like how you were supposed to dress, how you were supposed to talk, the expressions you were supposed to make, the things you were supposed to like. Everyone else seemed to understand how you were supposed to just function, and I feel like I could never quite get it right. One or two late in life neurodivergent diagnoses later, and now it all makes sense, but at the time, I just thought I was broken. I felt like something was really deeply wrong with me, and no matter how I tried to copy other people around me, it just never was quite good enough. And I saw a lot of these same feelings that I was experiencing reflected in Daria, but she just didn't seem to care. She saw that everyone around her was putting on a performance, and she made a very conscious decision not to join in on that performance, despite the consequences. And even though she was mostly ostracized and often disliked, she never stopped being who she was. Daria was always unapologetically herself. She never pretended, she never masked. It was an inconceivably brave act to me at the time, and honestly, most of the time it still is. And I'm not trying to discount the fact that she had Jane, and I completely understand that a good friend like that is so much more than many people have, but I also could appreciate how lonely it must have felt to be the black sheep and the scapegoat of her family so often. To not feel understood or always wanted by the people who chose to bring you into the world and were supposed to love you, that really hit home. And again, Daria was lucky here because at the end of the day, it did seem like her family actually did love her and want her, even if their relationship wasn't perfect, which again is a lot more than some people have. And just to be clear, a lot of the stuff I wasn't allowed to watch, like A Dirty Shame, I truly had no business watching at the age that I saw them at. But other things, like the Cosmos, were forbidden simply because they didn't fit a narrative. And part of that narrative was that it was a horrible, disgusting sin to be anything but cis and hetero, so much so that when I figured out that some of my family members didn't fit into that category, I wasn't allowed to see them again for several years. And when I said I wanted to kiss my best friend when I was in first grade, who was a girl, I got in trouble and spent the next 15 years thinking that Satan was trying to drag me down to hell because I thought girls were pretty. If it wasn't for movies and TV shows like these, I wouldn't have seen members of the queer community depicted in a positive and normal light at all. I couldn't even admit to myself that I was queer until I was 18, and even then I was only out to my friends, and very few people ever met my first girlfriend. I went to pride parades in secret, and I had to remind people not to post pictures of me to socials. It was a really scary time, one that I got through only because I was so lucky to have such a loving found family, and because of the stories that I was watching on my screen. Not everyone is so lucky to have as many unfathomably patient and kind people in their lives who will ask questions until they slowly chip away at the years of indoctrination and pain. I was really lucky I had those people. I'm still friends with a lot of them to this day. And it was a really slow process. I didn't fully leave the community I was raised in until I was in my mid-20s. partially because my money and property weren't even in my name. The other reason it took so long was because of the codependence that had been ingrained in me. I truly didn't think I could survive on my own. Leaving everything behind meant throwing away safety nets, and as a self-employed person who didn't have a college education, it took years of planning and preparation to finally sever all ties, and even though I've been completely no contact with the community I was raised in for about 7 years now, there's still roughly 26 years of damage that I'm trying to fix. In addition to therapy and literature, I'm still leaning on shows and movies for examples of how healthy relationships work simply because I didn't see many examples for the majority of my life. Words like codependency, critical thinking, enmeshment, and boundaries were ones I'd never even heard of until the last few years. So, was I in a cult? When I think about how I was raised and how everything ended, my experiences seem cult-like at the very least. And at the end of the day, I'm not even sure if it really matters. I think all that really matters is taking responsibility, making amends, healing, and being the kind of person in someone else's life that I wish I had had in mine.